It's been a few weeks, but I'm back for episode 4 of this series that I promise will end one day. Today we're talking about loops in video game music and how Ori deals with them. In a video game, we hear a lot of music, notably a lot of time the same music, unless the game is very short, and yet even in a lawnmower speedrun we hear the same thing several times, or it uses little non-diegetic music. Little Nightmares is quite silent, but even there we find repeated elements since the music is sometimes informative, warning us of danger. Whether it's simple or frighteningly difficult, we will quickly face the famous loops in video game soundtracks. To manage or soften the loop effect, there are several tactics. Let's start with what I would call the infinite loop. Hero Quest's 15-second loop on emulation. If you listen to the Hero Quest soundtrack on the Amiga, you'll hear this. Well, no problem, you might say. Except that with emulation, the loop is broken. Trust me, I've watched countless hours of Hero Quest streams by British YouTuber Ashens, and I'm sorry to say that it's not quite what you hear. Just imagine the first 15 seconds looped for several quarters of an hour. Yep, after that, when the loops intensify and you finally get to the possessed harpsichord at 3:23, well, surprising as it may seem, you're almost happy. More seriously, the level design will impact the way repetition is handled. Is exploration free, completely linear, or somewhere in between? Is it a big zone, one consistent level, or something more heterogeneous with different mechanics, different gameplays? How much time is likely to be spent in a zone or gameplay sequence? What interactions are possible? What impact should success or failure have on the player? How can we make them want to keep on playing? And so many other questions. Let's take the rather classic example of layers, by which I mean when one or more instruments are added to gradually enrich the music without there being any overall thematic evolution. This is used, for instance, in Expand, in which you guide a small pink square through a graphic and not always welcoming maze. The progression is completely linear in the sense that no matter which playthrough you start, you'll find the same 4 zones in the same order, and in each zone the same puzzles in the same order. Within a zone, the difficulty of the puzzles increases and the music develops in a similar way, since with each new puzzle the music doesn't change thematically but gains in complexity. This means that if you fail, some elements won't appear until the puzzle is completed. The music starts again from specific places in the piece, which can lead to a feeling of frustration when you're waiting for the final outburst and it's just not coming. in Hollow Knight, by contrast, exploration is largely unrestricted, which means that layers are added and removed according to the difficulty of the room. 1 layer for the resting areas, 2 layers for the classic rooms, a particular music for some mini-bosses, the action layer, which is added for the challenge rooms or other mini-bosses, and bosses almost each have their own theme. Loops are relatively short, often between 2 and 3 minutes, not much more, but with the possible exception maybe of Kingdom's Edge and the White Palace, mostly, the repetition is largely avoided. The Path of Pain challenge, on the other hand, uses a completely linear progression, with each layer of music added as a new section of the challenge begins, giving, as you start a new phase, a very strong sense of accomplishment. The intensity of the music also contributes to this, culminating in a very short but extremely meaningful cutscene. The process is similar in Celeste, but it falls a little in between. Although you can take secondary routes to get strawberries, crystal hearts or tapes, or despite the fact that the game sometimes offers us 2 routes to go to the same place, during Chapter 6 notably, globally the idea is to go from point A to point B with a lot of troubles in between. You cannot backtrack and go back down most of the time, since the point is to climb Celeste Mountain. And the mechanics are introduced with an increasing difficulty. The music too gains in complexity as the screens are completed and each chapter will have its own music. One of the most famous moments, if not the most famous, is the part in Chapter 3, during which we help Celestial Resort Hotel manager Mr. Oshiro, surprisingly talkative for a ghost, to do his spring cleaning. We clean the boxes, the towels and the books, while a strange dialogue starts taking place between Mr. Oshiro and Madeline, who do not actually seem to listen to each other. Spoiler, it ends badly. Each time, the music gains in complexity and tension. I won't say much more anyway, there will be a video on Celeste fairly soon on the channel. Sometimes layers are added and removed, as in Chapter 1, so there are several superimposed audio files. Sometimes it is managed linearly and there is only one file. It depends on the possibility of exploration and what you want to convey from an emotional point of view. Is Madeline free or not at this moment? Let's move on and talk about roguelites. Well, one specific roguelite. In The Binding of Isaac, the order of the chapters is of course fixed, with its different floors and alternative path from the Antibirth mod and now Repentance, which has added most of its content to the base game. But the choice of rooms in a floor is relatively free. It's a game which is centered on an extensive knowledge of all the mechanics, the characters' mechanics, the object mechanics, what they do and their synergies, and the room mechanics. There are many different rooms and some have a particular mechanics, for instance the Devil Deals and God rooms. As a consequence, there's a music for each type of floor. One chapter is divided into 2 floors most of the time, and in parallel a different music for each type of room. The arcade, the shop, the Devil Deal or God room, the boss room, the library, the planetarium. For these particular rooms, the music is the same whatever the floor, but this allows a great variety of music and illustrates the importance of backtracking in Isaac, essential to make the most of the game. So we have two dimensions of the music that overlap. An atmospheric dimension, the music of the floors, and a functional dimension. The music indicates the function of the particular rooms, or at least implies that there are different functions. And even the floor's main music can have an almost informative dimension if we compare it to the alternative floors. For instance, the first chapter focuses on basements, the idea being that you're trying to escape your mother using a trap hidden under a rug in your bedroom. You end up in your basement. During Chapter 1, you'll have to explore two floors, each one being a basement, the regular floor, the easiest, or a cellar, or a burning basement, more difficult because the enemies are burning, which implies that they are faster or jump higher. A burning basement will have a different music than a basement, and it's interesting to hear the change between the two. The key is very different. A basement is around D, a burning basement is more like F sharp minor, so those aren't close keys. And from the first notes, we know that this is gonna be bad. The thematic element comes right away, like in the basement. The difference is less striking with the caves and flooded caves, for instance. The music can still loop, but in a different way because it is interrupted. As soon as you enter a particular room, the music of the floor stops, and when you leave this room, the music of the floor starts again, but from the beginning. There's also a layer triggered when the number and difficulty of the enemies reach a specific level. So everything is very codified, and it's kind of fun to just listen to a run of Binding of Isaac because you can retrace the player's steps just with the music. And since in a roguelite or roguelike death means game over, the music usually changes and or stops, sometimes giving you the opportunity to watch your death. It's always good to know which pixel killed you in Noita or how many enemies you slain in Rogue Legacy 2. In level-based games, in addition to the level design, there's also the question of length and or difficulty. If the levels are short and or difficult, if it's a die and retry, the fact that the loop stops each time can become particularly frustrating. In Super Meat Boy Forever and The End is Nigh, the latter working by screens, not levels, as it's a more static game, as each loop is related to a complete world or zone and death happens a lot, there's no interruption whether you just died or completed the level. Unless you go back to the menu, the music keeps on looping, there's not even an interruption from one level to the next. Crash Bandicoot 4 and Rayman Legends, for instance, are more heterogeneous in their level design and gameplay. There are free exploration phases where you can backtrack a bit, some guided phases like the sliding sections in Crash Bandicoot, and escapes. The music generally works by sections too. This is very strong in Rayman Legends, as there are also hidden zones in which some of the teensies are held captive, another opportunity for the music to change. This is not surprising, since Rayman Legends' style is very cartoonish, also in its music there are very cartoonish techniques and discontinuities. Each level is made truly independent of the others by the score screen and how we systematically return to the level gallery after one of them has been completed. On the other hand, as deaths are generally less frequent, there is, at least for Rayman Legends, a fairly obvious interruption. The loop actually resumes. One can get rid of the loop by making the success of a game, of a level, determined by the music. In Crypt of the Necrodancer, a roguelite with a musical component, since you have to move in rhythm with the music in order to keep your coin multiplier, like in Metal Hellsinger, you get to the next level either by beating a mini-boss or by surviving until the end of the piece. You can't have a loop. In Dome Keeper, there's no loop either, but for a different reason. In this roguelite, we play a character landing on a planet to farm its resources, which is met with the ire of the planet's creatures. We therefore switch between exploration phases when we dig to find resources in order to improve our equipment. There are 3 types of materials as well as more specific improvements, gadgets, and combat phases during which our ship is attacked by waves of enemies. It's the success of a combat phase that is sometimes highlighted by music that doesn't loop, briefly accompanying the return to the depths and the rather contemplative nature of this exploration. But the game is not silent at all. Dome Keeper's sound design is really developed, and even graphically we find some nice details, such as the parallax in the depths, the alcoves where we find the gadgets, or the flora and fauna that gradually appear after we destroy the rocks. The fact that the music doesn't loop makes it kind of precious, like a musical reward, and reinforces how contemplative those phases feel, also leaving room for reflection. In Dome Keeper, you don't dig just anyhow, anywhere. There are rules for you to be efficient. In Stray, repetition is used sparingly. There isn't non-diegetic music all the time, firstly because the fact that you're in a city means that you hear a lot of diegetic music. You often enter bars or stores. Adding non-diegetic music would be too chaotic. What's more, you won't always hear the same tracks at the same moments from one playthrough to the next. For musics that are not tied to cutscenes or specific gameplay phases, a track is chosen from a playlist. And yes, there will also be a video on Stray on the channel soon, so I won't go into too much detail. Or you can take the gamble on a guitar solo that will stick in your brain until the end of time, like Ridiculon, again, in Super Meat Boy Forever, again. Think what you want, but at least the guitar is in tune, right, Luca? Puzzles are games that can put the loop to the test. If you get stuck on a level for too long, if the loop is a little too short, it will quickly get on your nerves. To avoid this and customize the game experience, a very nice example is Myst 3. For the ages, the worlds themselves, at least for the PC version, it's not a fixed loop but a script-based generation. There is a base, which will loop for a long time and then stop for a few minutes before starting again. On this base will be grafted iterations of the melody. There are often 2 times the melody for each file, with an evolution. You have more rhythmic patterns, stingers, with enough time between each intervention for it to breathe. But of course you can't just choose the files randomly, there has to be a coherence to the speech, even if it's less formal than a completely written loop. So there's a script that controls the playback of the additional files. How many times you can hear it, will it loop or not, how much silence between several repetitions. This gives a very organic effect that suits well Myst's ages, especially Edana. We can go even further and use music and/or sound design as a fully fledged interactive element. French composer Olivier de Rivière is particularly involved in this process, and in the games he has worked on, he has always found multiple ways for the music or the sound design to really react to what the player does. In Get Even, there's a huge amount of work on the mix between diegetic and non-diegetic elements. Sound effects are triggered in rhythm with the playable character's heartbeat. A drone will be influenced by NPC's gunshots. Diegetic elements morph into non-diegetic elements. The sound of a passing train becomes a non-diegetic drone. The same goes for a police siren, which then serves as the basis for the music, which an orchestra then joins. It's both extremely immersive and responsive. In Remember Me, the music for the combat system is entirely responsive. Several states are defined. First combo, combo, failure, waiting, low life, overload, death, and the music will change according to the state you're in, with transitions or not between states, depending on the impact you want the player to feel. I've added in the description a link to a video in which the composer himself explains the whole process.
Hey, terrorist! I'm putting you in hospital! We want her alive! together. Is that so?
In the A Plague Tale franchise, some instruments are associated with the enemies. In A Plague Tale Requiem, for instance, the percussion will be louder if an enemy gets closer.
I'm coming!
He's on his way.
Where are you? I can smell your fear.
Let's hunt the hunter again.
Or is it
Yes, it's the
your
only way to
royal
win.
bad breath? All kings fall, sire. Goodness!
You got so scared.
In Ori, we could say that the music loops in a classical way, but it would be, especially for Ori and the Will of the Wisps, a bit simplistic, because there is precisely a very thorough work to make us forget about the repetitions. There are no layers, no script, no evolving or adaptive music as such, but there are other methods to give this impression of a great organic movement. The opening sequences, in particular, the first half hour of the game approximately, develop very nicely with a strong connection between music and story. And even if Ori and the Will of the Wisps goes further than the first opus, but that'll be for the last video of this series, let's start with Ori and the Blind Forest. An admittedly roundabout way to improve the loop is to see the music on a larger scale. Listening again for the 100th time of the OST of Ori and the Blind Forest and Ori and the Will of the Wisps, I found something very beautiful in the whole evolution of the two introductions. In the case of Ori and the Blind Forest, it goes from the beginning of the gameplay to the arrival in front of the Spirit Tree. The whole musical progression of the beginning of the gameplay is going to illustrate Ori's return to life, this idea that I had evoked in the second video of this analysis, that the platforming is a way for Ori to accept their spirituality, that of their fellow spirits, and to face the forest in a playful way. Ori and the Blind Forest begins with a long prologue in which the music quickly shows its richness, starting by introducing the elements of the narrative and the initial world before the disaster, to culminate in a very spectacular way with the death and the resurrection of Ori. If you have watched the first video of this analysis, you know all about this. However, we don't know anything about Nibble when the gameplay starts. We don't have any attack, and Ori, who just came back to life, can seem still fragile, which is accentuated by the cold color palette of this first area. Hence a rather calm, but not necessarily shy, music that highlights some key instruments of the soundtrack, notably the piano, taking up the motif of the blinded forest from the prologue, also heard in the resurrection scene and developing it, and the oboe, probably the instrument most associated with Ori. The melody doesn't arrive immediately, the discovery is progressive in this place that urges us to be cautious. The very first enemy that we kill is in fact dead without any attack from us, we just have to avoid it. Ori's state of mind and the discovery of the player are translated by the large intervals on the oboe, notably in the second part of the melody. There are only 3 notes whose order changes, which try to open up the melody, but the symmetry comes to deny this attempt and everything falls down in a repetition which bears signs of giving up. What to do in this decimated and unknown forest? Ori did not live there, without attack nor protection. The vivacity and the plenitude of the life with Naru, the abundance of Nibble, at least Swallow's Nest, all that has disappeared, of course. It's been replaced by an almost serious music, but particularly all the elements connected to the spirituality, at least what made it belong to the Merveilleux, that we had discovered in the prologue, this organic voice, the sounds, the glissandi of the spirit tree's calls, his breathing also. Nothing's here anymore, everything has disappeared. The spirit tree used his remaining strength to bring his child back to life. Ori, attracted earlier by the light of their father tree, is however unaware of their intrinsic nature, or at least they've been kept away from it since birth. The forest itself lost this spirituality when Seine was taken from the spirit tree by Kuro. She is however still alive, and the scene when Ori discovers the tree's light will bring the spirituality back in the forest and in the music, because Seine is now found, but also because Ori is going to stay in the forest to save it. Nibble's less spiritual elements are going to remain there. The hero, yet a fleeing hero, is going to face this spirit nature which is unknown to them. Even before the music from the combat tutorial, the discovery of Seine will initiate the return of the spiritual sound elements, the breath sounds, which also blend with the natural atmospheric layers, the lightness of the trill on the strings, which yet darkens to announce the danger of the possessed creatures, and also to lead us to move forward, to do something. If the music becomes tense, it means that something must happen. Then when we pick up Seine, the voice, a female voice, and thunder, recurrent in the sound design, to translate the power of the spirit light. Everything's back. After that, we find the music of the battle tutorial that I already analyzed at length in the first video of this channel. It allows us to hear the sonic color so distinctive of Ori, by the combination of the piano, the percussion, often very soft but with very audible attacks and using instruments with definite pitches, and the flute. The music doesn't change after the tutorial ends, however there is something that adds to it, the sound design of the spirit flame, which is strong. Very strong. Sound design is important in a game, it can be used as a counterpoint. I'll talk about it again with Quolox Hollow. Yet something does change with the discovery of Seine. Ori must stay in the forest. As I had pointed out in my second video on Ori, each forest, Nibble the Naywen, is, among other things, a reflection on the way Ori lives their spirituality. While they're seen as a hero on the run at the beginning, they now have to accept their spirituality by acquiring the powers of their fellow spirits. What brought Ori to fight in this tutorial acted as an awakening. Remaining in this forest, of which they only knew a small part, Swallow's Nest, Ori will discover its history and its richness. We know that Nibel and Nywen are places with a fabulous design, a playground for the small spirits. The color palette warms up quickly, and we arrive in the spirit caverns where one of the themes from the prologue comes back, that of the life with Naru. I usually call it the harvest theme. It is treated in two different ways, before unlocking the wall jump, and after. Obtaining the wall jump offers a new dimension to the gameplay. It is a first opening to verticality. The level design becomes strongly focused on faster and faster jumps, just before arriving near the spirit tree, which will be underlined by the music, with a very clear pulse, the 16th notes on the strings, give an illusion of acceleration while the tempo has not changed, and strengthened by the PIDs, always very bouncy. The dangers are thus turned into moments of amusement. The music is more open than in the Sunken Glades. The theme is associated with Ori's carefree childhood and the abundance of Swallow's Nest. And especially the phrasing of the instrumentalist is very lively, with the small portamenti on the violin, for example, or the clarity of the sound of the flute. The oboe always takes the lead. The music thus seems to be treated from Ori's point of view. It would probably be reductive to connect this instrument only to the little spirit, but the fact that Ori is here completely alone, and the choice of a clearly solo oboe, seems to obviously express the opening of the hero to this forest, which is a part of them. There is finally a form of sonic euphoria in the beauty of the orchestration. It's always remarkable in Gareth Coker's music, and in particular in Ori, thanks to the overall instrumentation. The mix of woodwinds and the work on the percussion to discreetly bring some texture and, as often, a lot of light. The affirmation of the nascent spirituality of the little hero is completed with the arrival at the foot of the spirit tree. The organic vocal lines, without words nor even syllables, it's a little melismatic, as well as the percussion, make us completely bathe in the spiritual elements that the music of the prologue had sketched. But the spirit tree is also the place of a loss, that of Ori, of a quest to find them, the light ceremony, then of another tragedy, that of Kuro, who lost her children and in return slaughtered the spirits. The melody, the main theme, settles in very lyrically on the piano. The key, F sharp minor, is more tense than what we've heard before, to be taken up on the strings one octave higher, still accompanied by the voice, mixing the magical atmosphere of this place with its very concrete pain. There are 3 dungeons to explore. Ori is now well established in the forest. Another way for Ori and the Blind Forest to go past the loop effect is, in addition to varying the ambiances of the zones, to vary the gameplay. This will be more interesting in Ori and the Will of the Wisps because the combat gameplay is more developed and several musical dimensions will be superimposed, but we already can hear a kind of outline of this idea in Ori and the Blind Forest. Ori's difficulty lies in its platforming. Combat is rather simple, and if there are some mini-bosses, they are not much of a Grimm or a Malenia, they are, let's be honest, anecdotal. On the other hand, the platforming is interesting because in spite of being generally demanding, it has a certain variety. It's very fluid in the escapes in particular, yet sometimes it requires a little more thought. There are even some puzzles. This will inevitably influence the music, whether it's the way it loops, should the music resume at each death or keep a continuous flow, or the atmosphere to instill. Escape musics will accompany us, give us a kind of support by their intensity. The elements of the forest put us in danger, while other moments leave a little more room for reflection or even avoid an oppressive atmosphere, Mount Oru in particular, to be drawn out and sometimes from the scorching heat of the volcano that illustrates a logically intense, oppressive music, will emerge a well-known leitmotif, now quite impish. What also works in Ori is that the zones are not very big, and some are completed almost without backtracking. The progression in Ori and the Blind Forest remains very guided. So you don't stay there that long, notably the zones after the dungeons, to breathe a little. For example, the aquatic zone in Thornfeld Swamp after the Jinzo tree. You can get almost everything in one go, and even more in Sorrow Pass, since it's here that you get the last power. You can logically do everything before heading to Mount Oru. More simply, given that the areas are rather small, you can navigate quickly from one to another and the music changes often, especially during the usual backtracking moments. Larger areas can use other methods to vary the music. In Tinykin, Alexis Laugier has done a very nice job on adaptive music. Each level of this excellent 3D platformer is a room from the house, very large at our scale. The character is tiny, as the title indicates. Well done, Sherlock. And the music adapts its instrumentation, notably, to the sub-area of the room. You're in a guitar? Let's get the guitar out. Same thing for the piano. In the chapel, it's the organ that will underline the canticle as well as the NPC's cantillations. For the second game, it goes even further. Ori and the Will of the Wisps is a much more generous game than its predecessor in terms of length, gameplay, graphics and music. Everything is more. This generosity is already perceptible in the overall sound of the score. I already explained how the strings notably had this sound so specific, these absolutely magical impulses, or the vibrancy of the woodwinds in the Wellspring Glades. The choir also has a more important role. It's also more generous in terms of quantity, simply because the game is longer, there is more music, it's a bit mechanical, but the design of the world, the more versatile gameplay, the presence of other characters, all this will enrich the music and more precisely break the repetition of the loops. A first asset is the knowledge of the gameplay. Gareth Coker is an experienced gamer, he has access to the game during development, and this knowledge kind of bursts precisely in the gameplay sequences. The cutscenes being by essence punctual, the music doesn't loop, except in the short moments of gameplay, since Ori often mixes the two. I come back to this in yet another video. What's interesting, but not necessarily concrete, I suppose it's more of a feeling, but it's quite fascinating to be aware of it and to grasp all its nuances, is to see that in the moments where intrinsically there has to be repetition, the gameplay time is anticipated and the music is treated to adapt to it in a way. This was already the case in the first game for The Escapes, at least the first one, whose musical loop is written to last just as long as the duration of a perfect, no-death run. You can escape from the Jinzo tree at the very moment the end stinger is meant to happen in the actual OST. This is still the case in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, but these are particular moments without exploration. Ori, having this cinematographic aspect, it has many small moments of staging, if only in the beginning of the gameplay, or the cutscene where we see Ku lost in the Silent Woods, for instance. There is therefore a lot of music that we hear only once, which is also true for some important moments of the gameplay. All the first part of the game lends itself well to this because Ori is plunged in a deep melancholy, which calls for a relatively slow tempo, a certain abandon of the music, of the theme, which will necessarily require longer loops, or which seem longer. The material must take time to develop. Ori's sadness pours out, even if we are going to follow the return of the light in Ori's heart and in the forest too. For example, at the beginning of the gameplay, there is 1 minute 42 seconds of introduction before the first loop starts, the piano arpeggios that lead to the English horn solo. We will never hear this music again. It's a lot. There are only a few minutes of exploration before the first boss, Howl. The introduction takes almost 1/4 or even 1/3 of the sequence. The loop itself lasts 2 minutes, the solo takes almost half of it. Again, on the scale of the zone, it's a lot. There is also a challenge music, admittedly very short, but it brings a first variation. So we will hear the solo only once or twice and it's already time to face Howl. After the fight, the music will already change. For the next part, when we go back to the surface, it's the same idea. After a few moments of silence in the wolf's den, the scene when we acquire the blade and the cutscene with Naru and Gumo have their own music, one loop when Ori walks, Then 1 minute for the cutscene, and then a 4-minute loop for a gameplay sequence that's about twice as long. And another one after opening the door in Hell's Den, a shrine upon Inkwater Marsh, a 3-minute loop for, again, a gameplay time that's about just double until the arrival in front of the silhouette of the mill. And within the different loops, there are so many moments of transitions, of waiting. The loops are very constructed and really take the time to evolve when necessary. But time is not the only variable. To sublimate the musical loop, there are other ways to bring variations to it, whether they are discrete and punctual or radical, and each method finds its origin in the gameplay. Although Ori and the Will of the Wisps remains platforming-oriented, it offers a more varied gameplay in the image of this older, even more dynamic hero. There are more advanced challenge rooms, there were a few mini-bosses that were a bit anecdotal in Ori and the Blind Forest, with several waves and some new mechanics like the Spirit Trials, the races, and Battle Shrines, 4 waves of enemies, if you kill them all, small fragment slots. Each new mechanics has its own type of music. What is associated with combat is always more concrete. What is associated with Spirit Trials, the races, is lighter, even if it's often thematically close. We find the idea of the 2 dimensions as in the Binding of Isaac, the dimension related to the floor, here the zone, and the dimension related to the function of the room, here the kind of trial we are facing. But here they are completely superimposed because the music of a room, of a mechanics, changes according to the zone, taking up its thematic elements. For example, in Boar's Reach, the main music, after obtaining the power, is this one. For the fights, the same theme is used with a much more dynamic feel. However, it's necessary to leave some room for the music of the Spirit Trial, so the tempo is not too fast, especially the instrumentation is a little heavier, with notably the percussion interventions. If we listen to the loop of the Spirit Trial, it is much more lively and light. The impetus is partially shifted towards the high register, the overall texture is more airy. Same thing for Le Maples. The bass loop is this. The combat is lighter than usual because the area is treated positively. It's a playground for the monkeys. But even so, the trial loop is even lighter and even higher. This is also true for the fanfares, the stings or stingers rather. The fight's introductions are more intense thanks to the tremolos, among other things. This works the same way for each zone. Even if some aspects of the gameplay are completely optional, the spirit trials, the combat shrines, there are anyway some sequences we have to play that will allow a break in the music, be it the waves of enemies, or some short escapes. In the final dungeon, Widow's End, as in Mount Uru by the way, we have a mini escape. It too has its own music, close to that of the mini-boss. The general musical atmosphere of Widow's End is too static to really be appropriate for an escape, even a short one. You need something else. It was even more spectacular in Mount Uru. The escape itself was more spectacular. What will enrich the music of Ori and the Will of the Wisps is also simply the fact that we hear other themes. If one could associate most of the first game's musical material to Ori, this is not the case anymore in the second opus. Of course, this is not strictly speaking related to the musical loop itself. The leitmotifs will be analyzed in another video anyway. However, some important NPCs have a staging which will involve some introductory music, which we will hear only once. Let's move on. Well, not quite. Because NPCs often come with quests, and quests often come with fanfares. Moreover, Ori, especially Ori and the Will of the Wisps, is a game with a lot of collectibles, life and mana half cells, spirit light containers, and at the scale of a relatively small map. There are more fanfares in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, some very light, others with more instruments, depending on the type of item obtained or the quest completed, and in all the different keys. The fanfares themselves will allow to participate in the variation of the loop because they are perfectly integrated into it. The fanfare does not follow the harmony of the music at a given moment, but it is chosen according to the main key of the music. In the areas where you can move faster, especially the windswept wastes after getting the burrow ability, the exploration phases are enhanced by all these little variations. It also dresses up a relatively silent game. Of course, there was Sane in Ori and the Blind Forest and the NPCs in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, but the gameplay phases themselves, although far from Hollow Knight's beautiful austerity, can be rather silent, I mean dialogue-wise. In Crash Bandicoot 4, which I mentioned in the first part of the video, there are very few collectibles, fruits, gems, so there are very few fanfares or stingers. The most characteristic sound element is that of the checkpoints. It's an arpeggio, something quite simple, but it follows the harmony of the music, the tempo, and it seems to me that the various elements from the stinger are managed in such a way that the arpeggio will always be in rhythm with the music. This is interesting when you compare it to Rayman Legends. The latter is very cartoonish, as I said, full of discontinuities, musically speaking, from one sequence to the next, and in its general construction. It has a very strong musical presence with recognizable themes that are very much highlighted. Crash Bandicoot 4 functions a bit differently in its music from a thematic point of view, at least for the levels I was able to record. There aren't necessarily themes that take over the gameplay experience, and while there are clear music changes per gameplay sequence, it's less spectacular than in Rayman's Adventure. The complete integration of the stingers into the music means that when they are heard, there is no break in the music at all. You can stay focused on the gameplay, which is, it seems to me, more demanding than in Rayman Legends. This variation in instrumentation is used and amplified in the Wellspring Glades, where each sub-area, each Mookie hut, sees its instrumentation change with an emphasis on brass, where there is fire, or flutes in the Mookie's high dwellings. Looper also has his own arrangement. There are 6 in all, not counting the main outside loop. However, this method is quite rare in the game. Most of the time it is new music that will appear because the world of Naywen, in our presence, is particularly changing. It is of course quite common to change the music of an area after something significant has happened. In Metroid Dread, areas patrolled by enemies have different music once the robot has been destroyed. In the presence of an enemy, all these zones have the same loop, which does not feel really complete, however, until you hear the lovely enemy sound design. Grief. As soon as the enemy is destroyed, the danger disappears and the loop is customized. Each enemy zone has a post-mortem loop. The opposite is also true, like with the Forgotten Crossroads becoming the Infected Crossroads in Hollow Knight. In Tears of the Kingdom, there's a very nice narrative effect in the Lookout Landing loop after you've completed the 4 major dungeons, and Zelda has appeared in front of the castle. Elements from Hyrule Castle's loop, the piano octaves mostly, are added to the initial Lookout Landing loop. It changes again after all Phantom Ganons have been confronted and beaten in the Sanctum. Or in Breath of the Wild, the shrine loop changes if you return to a shrine that has already been completed before. Well, back to Ori. The very presence of Ori brings Naywen back to life, and we discover several areas from different angles, graphically, or thanks to the platforming. Generally, obtaining a power gives us another way of reprehending the area, more free, besides giving us access to what was out of reach. In Ori and the Will of the Wisps, it goes a bit further because the ability can really transform the area, like the fire in Boar's Reach, or change our relation to it in a more radical way than a simple double jump, for example. The sandy depths of the windswept waste are revealed when we acquire the burrowing skill, and the platforms become propulsion tools. This starts from the first area seen under two lights, by night and by day, with daytime coinciding with our acquiring the Spirit Blade, and thus the arrival of a Guardian for Naywen. Without even counting the boss or challenge musics, there are 3 different musics for the same area, separated by the storm, Now Use the Light We Want to See, and A Shine Upon Ingwater Marsh. We will see it in the last video, but these 3 musics will underline the return of hope for Ori, as they will know they're now accompanied, helped in their quests. Then, in the hold part, when we go in search of Quolock, Ori is subjected to quite the ordeal in order to show themselves worthy of the Toad. His leitmotif will guide us and adapt to all the gameplays, all the emotions too. I will detail all that in the last video. Again. In the Silent Woods, the reunion with Ku will revive her leitmotif, but the incursion of Shrek in a disturbing hide-and-seek session will change her music again. Then, for the 4 main areas to be explored to recover the wisps, the music will systematically change, either when the new power is obtained or after the boss fight, this one marking an important moment for the area. When Mora is freed from the corruption that fogged the mind and the depth of the darkness that engulfed Ori, the loop has to change. Tragedy has been avoided. Likewise, by killing Quolock, alas, we free Lumapol's waters from the false spirits. The music changes again. For Boar's Reach, it's the power that brings a new musical loop, which will remain, just like the Windswept Waste, except that upon obtaining the burrowing ability, there's a very powerful one-shot, a short musical moment that we will hear only once. It's sad. But there's another, more intense loop as you approach the Winterhorn runes, and of course several musics for the runes themselves. You know, the maggots there. Naiwen being larger than Nibel, there is even transitional music for the less specific areas where one is just passing through, as it were, or as a discrete introduction before presenting more thematic elements, such as in the Midnight Burrows. Like the fanfares, there are several instrumentations, 3 actually, and several keys. Those different ways to improve musical loops are used throughout both games and will be found in some of the narrative arcs I'll be analyzing from a musical point of view in the last video, this never-ending series, the beginning of Ori and the Will of the Wisps gameplay and Quolox Trials. But before that, in the last part of this video, let's have a look at a very impressive mill. The Wellspring is our first dungeon, much more imposing than any of the dungeons from Ori and the Blind Forest, at least that's what we're led to believe. It is first revealed in a long shot, allowing us to embrace in its entirety the fabulous multi-story structure that we must tame in order to find Ku. Who says mill says elements, but there's nothing surprising in that. Wood, water, a bit like the Jinzu tree, but here a large part of the dungeon takes place outside since we alternate sequences in the mill and others outside. The area that is to be explored is much larger than the mill itself. It really is a very beautiful dungeon. So the music will separate the outside of the mill, imposing, more focused on the wind, the flutes, and a more impish, teasing inside. We will discover the Wellsprings backstage, the gears get rid of the corruption that's keeping them still to put all this back in motion. There is a kind of mandatory thing in a mill, the rhythm. When an object or a structure inherently possesses a regular rhythm, such as a spinning wheel or a mill, one is tempted to use this specificity in music. A famous example is the Mill in Jenůfa, an opera by Czech composer Leoš Janáček, illustrated by a regular, even haunting rhythm on the xylophone. However, we don't want the regularity of the mill to become a darker metaphor. This is no Janáček opera, and it is in a much brighter way that the structure will be conjured, with notably a small ascending motif, occasionally found in Lummerpools, regularly restarting the machine, and as often a choice of tones which counterbalances the depth of the strings. The mill is massive, but source of hope, since it will lead us certainly to the ashes and mud of the Silent Woods, but especially to our sister. Moreover, it is dual in its design, since, although corrupted and full of spikes, it has also got invaded by moss and lovely flowers. Outside, the pulse does not appear immediately, although the percussion interrupts the previous music in order to signal the arrival in front of the dungeon. When we arrive in front of the mill, we're coming from a transition zone between the glades, the hub, and the mill itself, so the music is one of the transition musics in the appropriate key, D major. But despite the importance of the percussion, the low ones, to notify the imminence of something important, the others, higher and drier, to recall the elements, and notably a sound characteristic of the whole previous part about Quolock, we begin instead with a kind of long breath accompanying the camera's upward movement, as if Ori was taking a long breath while studying the building in front of them, or a form of breathing of the mill itself, which would come back to life, metaphorically, with the arrival of Ori, as areas are very often personified anyway in the franchise. Interspersed with percussion and strings gestures, we can hear very discrete trills, in a very slightly ascending movement too, as everything is discreetly enveloped by the choir. When this long breathing is finished, the rhythm settles, there is even a vocal ostinato, very discreet, a little drowned by the choir itself, before the flute states the theme of the wellspring. As always in Ori's score, the pulse never sounds like a constraint. Here it discreetly accompanies the restarting of the old mill, gaining more importance until the end of the piece, regular but organic, giving way to the flute, to its slight portamenti. It is the return to life of the mill. One would even say that the whole forest rejoices when the orchestra and the choir impose themselves in a very soft solemnity. The regular movement of the mill is emphasized during all the last minute, anticipating what Ori is going to do. The music of the outside of the mill will always be this one, before and after restarting the mill. It mixes therefore the before and the after, the discovery and the restart. But the strings are still there, and I'm not gonna complain about that. Inside, the atmosphere is no longer the same. We start with a look inside because that's what Ori does. They take a look at what's going on inside this mill. Just before starting the exploration of the inside of the mill, there's a cutscene where Naru and Gumo leave Swallow's Nest for Naiwen. I had pointed out in a video that this was a relevant moment since two important decisions were juxtaposed, leaving for Naiwen and entering the dungeon, facing the building to find Ku. The musical link is done in an extremely clear way with percussion. The mystery lifts, it's time for the dungeon. The overall feel of the rhythmic introduction is a bit drier because we are inside, the mechanisms are visible, the wheels are really starting to turn. Outside, the mill was motionless and the music's progressive pulse was an illustration of the objective. The ostinato is very audible and it is shorter. It is reinforced by the PIDs on the double bass, but again it's never too much. The orchestra is never constrained by the pulse, the sound of the PIDs is very bouncy. This is far from being insignificant because the sound of the beats will depend on the desired effects. In Indivisible, all the music is based on energy. Everything oozes energy. The sounds, the total absence of rubato, even the PIDs are dry. In Seasons After Fall, on the contrary, you have the playful PIDs from the menu, and in some of the puzzles. And later, some arpeggios played pizzicato with a lot of vibrato. It is completely different. In Ori, the beats bounce. The effect is not too dry, the sound and the reverb, I guess, wraps a bit the initial effect and gives a structure without overdoing it. Another element that softens this ostinato is that, especially in the introduction, so when there's no main melody, it is not strictly identical. There's a small element that sometimes gets added, less rigorous because it has reverb, or a layer of beats that comes to double said ostinato. By adding very discreetly some variety, we give some character to this cell. When the theme is stated, it is done with classical instruments with a classical sound technique, no Aeolian sound or sound air mix. However, the theme is treated differently. First, we hear very quickly a B-F tritone with a long B, which comes back, breaking a little the quiet rhythm of the theme because there is no real challenge, for now. This tranquility, this distance, also offers a contrast with the majesty of the introduction of the dungeon. The flute will go a little further with the augmented second, B-flat C-sharp, and the rhythm is different with more tension release. The ostinato settles very comfortably in the transition, which keeps the tension with a stepwise motion on the PIDs, as if Ori was examining the place a bit before the theme comes back to the oboe, with this famous reverb I talked about at the beginning of my first video. The oboist is still in the middle. A second transition brings back a bit of mystery with the sublime color of the low strings, magnificent throughout the score, and little by little almost all the instruments come to add in their own way something to the ostinato, as if everyone was giving in to the soul of the meal, first the clarinet, then the flutes. I always have this feeling that in the tranquility of this melody, rather of its treatment, there is a form of personification of the meal observing, studying Ori, giving it back, wheel by wheel, its primary function. But this is not over. After facing a few enemies with the usual pattern of combat rooms, the ascending scale, a new mechanics is introduced. Some rotating mechanisms will allow us to access other areas of the dungeon, preparing us for the dungeon's pièce de résistance, the huge central wheel that will rotate several times to get to the other side and retrieve Tock's compass. Another cyclical element is the water geysers. So all this part is based on the cycle, the ostinato, within reminiscence of the previous loop, a look inside, the repeated notes in the winds, in particular in the flute. Of course, the music will follow our progression on the wheel and modulate from F minor to C minor. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that because for each step we'll hear a kind of swaying between several keys. The harmony is very changeable, but we do start in F minor. The collectible fanfares are set on the key of the music, not the harmony at a given time, and they are in F minor. Just like in the first music we heard inside the mill, a look inside, there is this sort of teasing in the music. The clarinet will use the main theme of the franchise, the descending stepwise motion. But the harmony being different, the feeling is different too. Anyway, the motif is slightly adapted, even more so afterwards when the second part is played one octave higher. The second iteration, in A minor after the first rotation, brings out this back and forth movement using repetitions. Each arpeggio of the accompaniment is played 4 times. While some rather disturbing cogs or mechanism sounds are heard, the percussion become more and more important, and without necessarily trying to explain everything, it seems as if the mill is waking up, the wood is cracking, the mechanisms are set in motion while the whole orchestra is being carried away by the swing, the back and forth of the ostinato, the back and forth of the harmony. This one has a very strange effect on me, as if following a determined path like the wheel of the mill. I have troubles explaining why. Perhaps thanks to the regularity with which the chords change. And the clarinet seems to give in to a strange tension. Do you want to try an octave higher? No? I thought so. We switch to B minor, but the flute, then the oboes soften the material previously stated by the proudly soloist clarinet. They color the strings in unison. The change of key and the acceleration of the tempo, as always, bring the necessary tension, but it's more discreet. In this kind of moments, it's all a matter of balance. You have to leave yourself some room because the dungeon is not finished. It ends with Quorlock's leitmotif briefly stated. He's the one who brought us here, after all. But if you keep turning, and turning again, you'll need a clear end to all this. That's where amelioration comes in. If we keep the idea of the mill with its percussion ostinato, with a sound more evocative of mechanisms maybe, The change with turn, turn, turn again is clear enough for us to feel that something has happened. There's no more solo clarinets, we hear instead the theme of the battle room, based on repetition, and most of all the motif of the mechanism fades away to give way to Ku's theme on the strings, with a lovely counterpoint on the clarinet. And then to the flute. You can imagine that, being a flutist myself, this moment of the piece is connected to a certain plenitude. I always feel at home when I hear the sound of my instrument, and no one cares, but still. The rediscovered rhythm of the maid is superimposed on its consequence. Ku will be rescued soon. This piece also introduces the key of the end of the dungeon. In order to keep some consistency throughout the last part of the watermill, we'll remain in C minor until the end of the escape. Okay, we've talked about loops, many loops. Next step in this never-ending series would be narration. But before that, we'll go to the Forbidden Lands and explore the land of the 16 Colossi. It's finally time for my analysis of Shadow of the Colossus. It'll be around 2 hours long, so you can grab the popcorn for this one. In the meantime, thank you for watching this video, and goodbye!